Hello everyone, I'm DayWeather meteorologist Don Day with a long-range winter outlook for this 2021-2022 winter season for the Western United States. These are the main climate factors for this upcoming winter. These are the drivers that will shape how the winter season goes. La Nina, first and foremost, is again going to be a big player. This is the second year in a row we have a La Nina. Stratosphere. Stratospheric warming vents are likely. This is when the stratosphere warms up near the polar regions and helps push cold air off the high latitudes to low altitudes. Basically, the polar vortex situation when you get these Arctic outbreaks. We saw that last year. We'll see that this year as well. A different sea surface temperature pattern is setting up in the North Pacific. It's much different than it was a year ago. There's a lot of similarities, and we'll show you, to the sea surface temperature pattern in the Pacific now compared to a year ago. But there's one big difference, and that's up in the Gulf of Alaska and the Northern Pacific. And that's already affected how the weather this fall has gone. Definitely noticeable with the wet weather that's returned to parts of California and the Pacific Northwest. That's because of that. Also, we're going into our new solar cycle. High variability will happen this winter. We saw this last winter. You could have 1 month relative to average that's really cold, and the next month could be relative to average pretty darn warm. Back and forth, kind of a weather whiplash situation. I think we're going to see that in many areas of the Western United States. And this leads to month-to-month alternating patterns. We saw that last year. We had a warm January, a really cold February. We had a really cold May relative to average, and a really hot June. That seesaw back and forth pattern is typical in a La Nina. We're going to see that again for this winter season. The analog year, the year that we went back into the historical archives that we think is closest to what will happen this winter, is the analog year of 2010 and 2011. Some remarkable similarities showing up to that time frame. So we'll talk about that as well. Let's rewind. This is where we were about a year ago. We saw La Nina robust and strong. We also had a very warm Central and North Pacific with this bullseye of warmer than average sea surface temperatures up here in the Gulf of Alaska a year ago. This is one reason why last fall was a very, very dry one here and a part of the Rockies. We basically had a situation where a lot of times those warmer sea surface temperatures help you get more moisture, but in the fall season, it's not necessarily the best setup. And we didn't have a strong jet stream wind coming into the West Coast last fall. That caused the jet stream to go way up here for most of last fall. But this fall, notice we still have La Nina. There it is again. But notice the difference up here. A huge difference. So we have this big contrast between these much colder sea surface temperatures here, contrasted against a warm pool here. So we have a warm pool and a cool pool. And that big difference in temperature is helping to maintain a very strong and energetic jet stream. And this is why in the month of October, it was so wet in parts of the Pacific Northwest, parts of Central and Northern California, and into some of the interior. So while there's a lot of similarities to a year ago, I want you to look at the difference up in the Gulf of Alaska and the North Pacific. This was last year at this time. This is now. Also notice how much colder the Pacific has become. Sea surface temperatures have really dropped over a good chunk of real estate here in the Central and Eastern Pacific Ocean. If we were to zoom in more closely, you can see this big contrast in the sea surface temperatures. This is something we're going to watch very carefully through the course of the winter season. If we see this continue, where there's this big pool of cold air here, water here, and a big pool of warmer water here, what this tends to do is make low pressure want to sit there. Doesn't mean it's there all the time, but more often it does, while high pressure sits here. And what that does is that makes a ridge here and a trough here, then a ridge over the western United States, which could sometimes mean the western United States is protected from real severe cold. If, on the other hand, warmer waters move into the Gulf of Alaska here, that kind of changes the dynamic. You end up with a high here and a low here, and that then changes the dynamic, and that allows the door to open up into Canada. So this is a real critical area to watch throughout the course of the winter. What we're going to do with this long-range forecast is assume that this isn't really going to change much, that rather this cold water in the Gulf of Alaska is likely going to stay. It may weaken a little bit and fluctuate, but we think it's going to hold. Now I want to talk about our analog year of 2011 and 2010, the 2010-2011 winter season. We had just gotten out of our last solar minimum and we're starting the new solar cycle. That's exactly where we are now. 2021, just getting out of our solar minimum, heading to the next solar cycle. 2011, that's about exactly where we were as well. So there's some solar similarities as compared to those sea surface similarities out in the Pacific and with the sun as well. So we're building this analog argument for you as we go forward. The prediction of La Nina continuing, the latest update shows this green line here shows the average of the computer models. Anything below this zero line is a colder than average sea surface temperature pattern in the tropical Pacific. And so you can see, and it's exactly what's happening. The La Nina is getting stronger, will reach its peak in December likely, and then begin to weaken and begin to fade by late spring, or we're hoping earlier than that. But it certainly looks like by April and May, the La Nina should be over. And we should be heading towards probably a weak El Nino in 2022 or 2023. So let's take a look at this 2010-2011 analog year. And I'm going to step you through what happened month by month in that winter season. One thing I need to stress, and I'll mention this several times during this video, is that an analog year doesn't mean you're going to have the exact same winter. It doesn't mean the weather will be exactly the same. But what it does mean is that it could be similar. And what you definitely see with these analog years is certain trends evolving. So it was a La Nina year. It was after the solar minimum. At that time, we also had that cold pool in the Gulf of Alaska and a warm pool in the North Pacific. So those sea surface temperature maps I just showed you are remarkably similar, and we'll show you that here in a moment. That year was a big snowpack year for the Rockies and the Pacific Northwest. In fact, there were some record snows when you got into the Cascades, when you got into the Bitterroot, when you got into the Tetons, the North Platte, the South Platte. All of the big snowpack drainages of the Central and Northern Rockies did very, very well in that winter season. So let's step through what happened in 2010 and 2011 during the winter season. This is something that's really interesting. So what I'm showing you is the precipitation anomalies for October 2010. What's really interesting, October 2010 was wetter than normal for the West Coast, and we had this little shot, this little area of above average precipitation that jutted into parts of the high plains and the northern plains. So this was what happened in October 2010. Look what happened in October 2021. Note, it's a very similar pattern. It's not exact, but here we go with an area of above average precipitation across a lot of the western United States in not an unlike pattern that we had in 2010. So that's one reason why we're looking at this as being an analog. So let's step through what exactly happened during the winter of 2010 and 2011. So let's go through November. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to show you each month and its precipitation anomaly. Then I'm going to show you the temperature anomaly for each month during the winter season. And so this is November of 2010. Where you see green, that means above average precipitation, blue as well. Where you see yellow, where you see brown or reds, that's below average precipitation. So you can see in the west, parts of the west did okay in the month of November in 2010. When we went to December, notice good rains along the west coast into the interior west and the northern plains. Again, there's a little bit of an arch, kind of like what we just saw in the month of October. As we go into January of 2011, it was a drier month with the heavier precipitation that was more towards the northern plains and the northern Rockies. And notice California and the West Coast dried out, and we actually think this is going to happen. I think that the better rain that's going to be getting California and the Pacific Northwest is on the front end of the season, meaning now through the month of November and through the month of December, and then maybe not as wet for California as we'd like it to be in January or February, and that's because you really want an El Nino for California, Central and Southern California to get wet. That was January. In February, nothing terribly organized, but kind of a patchwork of slightly above average precipitation, really nothing extraordinary, but at the same time, not really dry either. When we got into March, April, and May of 2011, it was quite remarkable. We saw an uptick late in the season along the west coast and into the central and northern Rockies. Notice the green in the central mountains of Colorado and southern Wyoming, the western mountains, and then up here into the Pacific Northwest. That was March. April, similar situation. In fact, the April timeframe of 2011 was very, very moist, very active in the higher terrain. You can see the green there of above average amounts of precipitation. Then look at May. May was cold and May was wet across many areas of the Pacific Northwest and Northern Plains and Rockies. Will this happen again exactly like this? The answer is no, probably not. But the trend is your friend when you use analog forecasting. What the trends are going to be, it's not going to show you exactly what's going to happen. So you don't want to look at this map if you live in eastern Montana and say, oh my gosh, in May we're going to get a ton of precipitation. What I'm showing you is that the tendency should be for average to above average precipitation if this analog year is going to work out. Now let's look to see what happened with temperatures during the course of the winter season. This is December of 2010. Notice how cold the nation is east of the Rockies into Florida, the Great Lakes. I mean, this is off the charts cold in a heavily populated area of the United States. We think this is something that's going to happen in December, but we may see the colder weather back more up against the continental divide. So a similar weather pattern, yes, but maybe a little bit more west with the cold. January of 2011, notice the cold expands. We have a deep, deep area of cold across the northern plains, also getting into the Great Basin as well. I think this is a bit of a question mark this winter season, as we feel that the better cold is going to be east of the divide. But this is what happened in 2011. February was cold as well in the west, directed more west than to the east. We do think that there's a bias this winter that's going to direct the coldest air more to the east and less to the west. Again, the analog is not going to give you the exact duplication, but similar patterns. March of 2011, we saw the cold again really focusing itself over the northern plain states, the Dakotas in particular, and the upper Midwest, while it got warmer across the southern plains and the southern tier of the United States. Temperatures in April were very cool in the west, very, very cool in May. So what we're seeing is potentially, as we go through the late winter and spring season, especially if we see a little bit of a return to warmer sea surface temperatures, that we may very well see the back end of winter, the latter half of winter, being the bigger areas of cold and precipitation for some areas of the western United States. Look at June. This is the temperature anomaly in the month of June, and this is something I do think we're going to see. Notice the red and the brown here across the southern plains and the southern Rockies. This is much, much warmer than average in June, but look how much cooler it is relative to average in the northern plains, the Rockies, and back into the Pacific Northwest. This would be exactly opposite of what we experienced last year. Everybody remembers how hot June of 2021 was. That may not happen as we get into June of 2022. Something to look out for and to watch. So if we were to add up all the anomalies across northern hemisphere, the North American continent, this is what happened in 2010 and 11. Blue and purple means below average temperatures relative to 30-year normals. The red, the greens, the yellows mean above average. What you see here was a very cold winter for Alaska, colder than average or near average temperatures in this large area here. We think a similar pattern will develop for this upcoming winter season, although it's going to be to the east a bit more. And one reason why we think that is that we do think that the low pressure that wants to be here at times this winter is going to maybe push that Arctic surge. The surges of Arctic air go a little bit more into the eastern and middle part of the U.S. as opposed to the western part of the U.S. So when we talk about analog forecasting, it's less reliance on computer modeling, more reliance on sea surface temperature patterns, solar interactions, emphasis on historical databases of similar patterns, and of course what the stratosphere throws at us. So what I'm showing you has little to do with modeling, but more of where we see similarities to winters past. One thing that you do see in La Nina winters is you do tend to see the jet stream patterns take this type of shape. Those white arrows you see on the map show you the more persistent storm tracks during the course of a La Nina season. One prominent storm track in La Nina is this west to east flow, and we're going to see this several times this winter season. This westerly flow brings in mild air off the west coast across the nation. This gives you the thaws. This gives you those warm-ups. This jet stream pattern right here is something we're also going to see this winter, and I especially think late winter and spring, is you get a very energetic and strong jet stream diving into the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies. The green shading shows you where you're going to have the best chances of precipitation. So this is why we could end up with a good snowpack here in this part of the nation here, because you have very strong jet stream winds literally just driving cold, moist air into the Pacific Northwest, parts of Western Canada, and into the Central and Northern Rockies. Notice a downslope component, and this is going to be important. This little wedge of dryness is due to downsloping or Chinook winds off the Wyoming and Colorado Front Range. So you could have a winter where it snows a lot in the mountains, but if you live along the Front Range, you're not shoveling very much. So it's one of those good situations to where you're not shoveling your driveway, but you're enjoying a lot of ski on the ski slopes. That's how that could end up going this winter season. This is another idealized example of what happens during La Ninas. I talked about that straight line, that west to east flow here. Well, that brings La Nina mild spells. We saw this past winter where you have basically some warm conditions because it's mild Pacific air. But what also happens in a La Nina is you get these big buckling jet stream patterns that opens the door to the Arctic. This is what happened in February of last year, i.e. the big Arctic outbreak that hit Texas. So odds are high, based to the similarities of the pattern that we have now to a year ago and what we saw in 2011, is that we are likely going to have Arctic outbreaks that could be of the magnitude or close to the magnitude of what happened a year ago. Doesn't mean it's going to be Arctic all winter, but episodes of Arctic air are likely to intrude, especially the central and eastern areas of the United States. So let's go back to a year ago. This is a great example of what to expect this winter. I'm showing you temperature anomalies for the winter January through April of last year, this past year. So this is January 2011. The red here and the yellow and the green shows a large area of above average temperatures for Canada, and most of the lower 48 states had a very warm January relative to normal. But we all know what happened in February, right? There is the exact opposite. A big intrusion of Arctic air came all the way down to the Gulf Coast. That was after a very warm January. So a warm January doesn't mean a warm February. In fact, look what happened in February. After February, March ended up being a warmer than average month for most of the nation. Then look what happened in April. A large swath of below average temperatures came in April across the nation's midsection. So you have this back and forth. You have this whiplash. One month is warm, next month is cold, vice versa. Think we're going to see that happen again this winter season. If you were to look at the historical trends of La Ninas and El Ninos, since we're in a La Nina, you want to look at this map here. This goes back all the way to 1949. That shows all the La Ninas since then and the precipitation anomalies. La Ninas tend to bring above average precipitation here and below average precipitation here during a La Nina season. That's exactly what has happened the past year. That's probably what's going to happen through the winter season and into maybe the beginning of spring, but we're hoping by spring La Nina is done. Conversely, over here, you can see how much better an El Nino is for the western United States to get wet. But this is where we are for another winter season. Let's take a look at what ended up last winter if we were to add up all the temperature anomalies for North America. So during December, January, and February of last year, if you added up all the temperatures, compared them to the 30-year average, the coldest part of the nation was right here with warmer conditions in eastern Canada and out here in the Pacific as well. For this upcoming winter season, we think that it's going to be more on a line like this. It's going to be more held up by the continental divide, and we also think this area here is going to be a lot colder than a year ago. That means a lot of the western United States is right on the edge of these Arctic outbreaks this winter. Yes, if you live along the Front Range, east of the Continental Divide, we're going to have some visits from the Arctic. But the coldest of cold may end up further east. And what I'm showing you here is the forecasted temperature anomaly for the globe for the 3 coldest months of this upcoming winter season, December and January and February. I want to show you something that really highlights why we have some concerns about this winter season, especially when it comes to the energy situation. This area here, including Alaska, parts of Western Canada, and a good part of the United States, with the exception of the desert Southwest, California, and western areas of the divide, is going to have a colder than normal 3-month period. Look at the cold across Europe, going into parts of Africa, into Asia, Russia, Siberia, and then back into parts of Asia here. These are some very large areas of colder than normal conditions in heavily populated areas of the globe. Notice the anomalies of warmer temperatures are out in the oceans, okay? Not necessarily over the continents. You've got another little warm one area, but right here. So the continents are likely going to be colder this winter in the northern hemisphere, where the warmer areas relative to normal are going to be over the waters. And what we're doing with this right here is basically we're just building this off of analogs, not only 2010 and 11, but other similar years as well. This large area of purple and blue here, that's La Nina. That's going to make the air temperatures colder than normal because of those cooler than normal sea surface temperatures out there in the Pacific. So let's take a look going down into the brass tack details here of what we think is going to happen this winter. First of all, that 2010-2011 year is very similar. It's not an exact match. That is usually the case. You never have a year that's exactly the same as an analog year, but close. Trend is your friend. And that's the most important thing here. Expect another high variability winter. Big swings are coming this winter. There's high probability of some very cold episodes in the lower 48 states and parts of Canada, especially central and eastern areas of the U.S. and Canada this winter season. There could be some really cold outbreaks into the middle part of the USA this winter. The West at times this winter will be on the edge of the cold. That means the Continental Divide is going to hold up these Arctic air masses. This could be a winter where one side of the divide can get really cold, but the other side of the divide does not, or doesn't stay cold for long. We see that as a real potential this winter. Unfortunately, that is a setup for wind. So for you folks along and east of the Continental Divide, I'm afraid to say when it's not cold, it's going to be windy. When it's not windy, it's going to be cold. And that's something we also saw in 2010 and 2011. So this means it's going to be warmer and drier for areas west of the Continental Divide during the January and December and February timeframes. The most severe cold this winter will be in the Midwest, the Great Lakes, and the East. The western edges of that Arctic air will occasionally push into the high plains, but will have a hard time getting over the Continental Divide. Now, if the cold air does have a chance to get over the Continental Divide, it could get trapped. And that's something that we'll watch and monitor with our daily podcasts throughout the winter season. The coldest months are likely going to be December and February. Now, when I say coldest, I mean relative to averages. So we may see relative to average December and February being the 2 months that are the coldest. When you take a look at those 3 months, December through February. Precipitation. In the western United States, we think the heaviest precipitation will be in the Pacific Northwest, the northern Rockies with a bias to the mountains, with less precipitation east of the divide. This is not a good pattern for the plains to get a lot of snow, especially the Front Range. It could snow a lot in the mountains, though, and we may have a really good snowpack, especially in the Pacific Northwest and the central and northern Rockies. The further south you go, let's say south of I-70, into the southern Rockies of New Mexico and Arizona and southern Colorado, southern Utah, your snow may not be as good the further south you are. Windy periods as Arctic air moves in and out east of the Continental Divide. As I mentioned earlier, do expect some wind. Watch the energy markets. As of the making of this video, natural gas was at prices we haven't seen in 10 years, and we're likely going to have these episodes of cold really make the energy markets move more so than we've had in a long, long time. Expect the real cold. If you're sitting here waiting, well, when is the cold ever going to get started? Late November and early December is when we see it starting to make its move. The southern Rockies and the southern plains, I am concerned about it getting pretty dry this winter into early spring. This would be Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, the panhandles maybe of Oklahoma into Texas. Those areas along and south of I-70, I do have some concerns that it could be a drier than normal and warmer than normal winter, and that could go into the spring season, and that would give us some concerns for the start of summer of 2022. La Nina is going to be fading by spring. We're pretty confident that we can say goodbye to La Nina for now, probably by April or May. Hopefully by then. If it can end by then, that means a more wet spring pattern, but we're just going to have to see how La Nina goes. So to get more specific, for you live, I've broken it out into these areas. For Northern California, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, and Montana, I'm expecting above normal precipitation, especially in the mountains. There's going to be some cold episodes for folks out on the eastern Montana plains, but less moisture east of the divide in Montana. But those northwest areas, I think, are going to have, especially early in the winter, could be quite wet. The central and southern areas of California, I'm afraid to say, Central California is going to get some rain. I'm concerned that Southern California is going to not get as much as they normally get December through February. And that's because of La Nina. It just doesn't favor Central and Southern California. It doesn't favor the Great Basin states as well, including Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. We're expecting above normal temperatures and below normal precipitation. For you folks in the Dakotas, get ready. It's going to be a long, cold winter. For North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, it doesn't mean there's a lot of snow this winter. I see a lot of cold, but what does fall, that snow's going to stick around. The western side of North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska, the Nebraska Panhandle, the western counties of South Dakota and North Dakota, you will at times get those Chinook winds, and the Arctic air may retreat. But for the central and eastern portions of the Dakotas, central and eastern portions of Nebraska, be ready for the cold. Wyoming and Colorado is like the battleground. Wyoming and Colorado is going to be a tug of war between the Arctic outbreaks to the east and the strong Pacific jet streams coming in from the west. So this is where we get a lot of weather whiplash, I like to call it. You're going to have frequent snows in the mountains. That's going to be good for the snowpack, but likely below normal precipitation east of the Continental Divide. That means the plains, that means the Front Range may be warmer and drier than normal for a good portion of the winter season. That's not to say we won't have Arctic outbreaks. We will. It's just that are not going to stay around for a long time. Western Colorado, you're going to be warmer and drier than normal, but this type of pattern will lead to above normal snowfall for northwestern Wyoming. That would mean the Yellowstone Plateau, Jackson, those areas, and other parts of western Wyoming. But Colorado's western slope, I think you're going to have a mild, drier than average winter before maybe your fortunes change with El Nino forming the year after. Going back to where we were, this is the one thing we're going to watch very carefully throughout the course of the winter season, and that's going to be right here. We know that La Nina is going to persist through the good portion of the winter that's coming up. If we see this pattern persist, we're very confident in the long-range forecast I just gave you. If, on the other hand, we see these warmer sea surface waters expand a bit back into the Gulf of Alaska, that will pull the Arctic air masses further west and make the western United States colder this winter than what we have in the forecast right now. And that's all it is. It's a forecast and it's an outlook. It's our best guess. We'll talk about this long-range forecast during our daily podcast, and we'll keep you updated through the course of the winter. But as it stands here in early November, this is how we think the winter will unfold. Thanks for listening to this long-range forecast. Have yourself a good winter season, and we'll provide updates as the winter goes along to see if we need to make any adjustments to this long-range forecast.